She got very specific about this design, and it turns out, it seems she'd been listening to some of the designers in the design office before they went to look at the aircraft, and rapidly assimilated some information, misinterpreted some of it, started giving lectures about where you should install the missiles on the fighter, which is, I don't think many prime ministers are that well briefed. I know she read her briefs, but I didn't find in the archives any briefing about that. But I think the interesting thing is Ralph Hooper was an intuitive designer, and she had a very instinctive reaction. The jump jet that he was designing, the idea was it would serve with the Americans as well.
Now, the Harrier became famous for its role in the Falklands, but behind it was a plan for an extraordinary next-generation jump jet, supersonic, stealthy, and designed for a future war with the Soviet Union. Well, the technology historian Mike Pryce has uncovered the story of that aircraft and why Britain ultimately never built it. His new book, Jump Jet, The Secret History of the Harrier, is out now. Hello, Mike. Welcome to Times Radio.
Hello, thank you for having me, Hugo.
Thanks for being with us. So, look, most of us think we know about the Harrier jump jet, particularly because of the Falklands. But what was it about this story that made you want to spend years digging further into it?
The striking thing, I think there was two things really. There was the chap who designed it, Ralph Hooper, who was a fascinating person to talk to. He thought about things his own way. And then I discovered that thinking that he did was actually allowed him to do things that computers couldn't do. So lots of people design aircraft using computers these days, but that actually limits what they can do, whereas with Ralph, he could kind of fly free and do things that others couldn't. And then in the Falklands, you saw the benefit of that.
Okay, and the remarkable thing about the Harrier was that it could basically take off straight up.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
It could. Normally it would take off after a short run. It would land vertically. It's quite a trick to do. It's very difficult. Most prototypes that other countries and companies built crashed, often killing their test pilot within the first few weeks of flying. Right. The unique thing about the Harrier was, although it wasn't the safest plane in the world, it was the jump jet that worked. And in the Falklands, that's what was needed. Lots of naval specialists will say that if you had the big American aircraft carriers in the Falklands, actually the weather would have meant they couldn't have flown the Tomcats and things like that. So the Harrier had unique abilities because of the unique abilities of the man who designed it.
And without sounding like incredibly dim, the advantage of this is it means that you can basically take off from a smaller boat.
You can, and you can land in a field, and in the Falklands on occasion they had to land on the small deck at the back of smaller ships in emergency situations. They had a very small fleet of aircraft, so that saved a few, and that helped save the force.
Right. So there was to be a successor. It was going to be a jet that was supersonic, stealthy, capable of taking off, landing vertically as well. How close did we come to actually building it?
Not as close as Ralph Hooper would have liked. There was a story, which I'm sure some of your listeners would have seen in the Times last Saturday, about how Margaret Thatcher visited the factory at Kingston upon Thames after the Falklands War, essentially to say thank you for the efforts. The engineers there had done lots of rush updates to the Harrier and got them sent down south for the fighting. And Ralph had been designing a new aircraft, this P-1216s you mentioned. They all have boring code names to start with. But they had built a full-size mock-up and they showed it to Margaret Thatcher, and she had a very adverse reaction. She just said, it doesn't look right, and if it doesn't look right, it won't fly right. The reason it didn't look right was because he did try to factor in the problems they'd found on the Harrier and design them out of the new aircraft, which is what gave it its weird appearance.
And so this would have been better than the Harrier in terms of, in what way? I mean, firstly, it would have gone a lot faster.
Yeah, it's double everything, twice as fast, fly twice as far, carry twice as much. So all the things that, military requirements list demands, and this was designed to meet them. The Harrier originally had been an experimental aircraft, so it was a bit of a bodge to get it into service. They did very well, but this new aircraft was specifically designed for the RAF and the Royal Navy.
So Margaret Thatcher saying she doesn't like the look of it. Like, I don't mean to be rude, but what the hell would she know?
Well, that's the thing. She's the Prime Minister that some people talk about in terms of she was a scientist. There's all this, they're all PPE at Oxford and they don't know anything about science, people say about politicians. But Margaret Thatcher was a scientist. She actually was involved in making part of the Harrier when she was an industrial chemist in the 1950s.
Okay. So plenty is the answer to that question.
She should know, but she got very specific about this design. And it turns out, it seems she'd been listening to some of the designers in the design office before they went to look at the aircraft, and rapidly assimilated some information, misinterpreted some of it, started giving lectures about where you should install the missiles on the fighter, which is, I don't think many prime ministers are that well briefed. I know she read her briefs, but I didn't find in the archives any briefing about that. But I think the interesting thing is Ralph Hooper was an intuitive designer, and she had a very instinctive reaction. The jump jet that he was designing, the idea was it would serve with the Americans as well. So he was trying to get it launched because the US Marines bought the Harrier as an Anglo-American project. She actually backed, oddly, a European project, which became the Eurofighter Typhoon, because there was data that could prove what it would do, whereas with Ralph's jump jet, it was more a case of, trust me, it will work.
Right.
And that's a hard thing to ask politicians for billions of pounds for.
What kind of conflict was it designed for? Because it wasn't conceived with the Falklands in mind. Obviously, it was conceived thinking about conflict with the Soviet Union.
Yeah, absolutely. It was World War III. World War III is supposed to last about 3, 4, 5 days before it go nuclear. And what they'd found was that done lots of analysis, operational analysis, the military had done, that showed that if you could extend it a few days, you might get to a negotiation before everyone starts nuking each other. And jump jets were seen as key to that, because actually they'd be much harder to wipe out by Soviet attack in the first few days.
And if it had been built, this jet, if it had become like a sort of a regular part of the RAF, perhaps the Royal Navy, what difference would it make? How different would the RAF and Navy look today?
Well, they'd have some very odd-looking aircraft, but they'd have got them probably sooner and more cheaply than the two aircraft that have effectively replaced it, which was the Eurofighter Typhoon and the F-35B Lightning II, the Joint Strike Fighter with America. And also it would probably have had more UK control over the design, development and operation. So the F-35, currently, previous job, I worked on the new Tempest fighter, and one of the drivers there is having sovereign capability, the ability to modify and maintain an aircraft entirely yourself without anyone else controlling the software or the spanners. And it would have enabled that, whereas with the F-35, there are some limitations on that. And the Eurofighter Typhoon, the UK is more sovereign, but every decision has to be made with 3 other partner nations. So it can be quite time-consuming if you're just adding a new missile or a new radar.
So, I mean, without overselling it, then would it have made a major difference to our defence industry if this had progressed?
Probably. I mean, the striking thing would be you'd probably have a couple of large factories in Surrey, which isn't the image people have of Surrey now. But I grew up in Kingston, and back then there were these big factories there, and in Weybridge, down near St George's Hill. So it would have both had a bigger industry, and the location would be different. We'd have more manufacturing in Greater London.
Look, finally, you tell a great story about discovering just how loud a Harrier really was. What happened?
I was at an air show about 20 years ago, and a friend had lent me some new noise-cancelling headphones, which were meant to be very swish, but I really wanted to hear how loud it was, so I just lifted one off, and very loud is how loud it was. It wasn't an immediate thing. It was a few weeks later I noticed I couldn't hear when I was in a restaurant and people were rattling crockery. I went to the doctors and they said, yeah, it's probably that. That's probably a silly thing to do.
Well, they looked in your ear and said, you've been listening to Harrier jump jets.
I told them that, but yeah, they could see the result.
Marvellous. Look, Jump Jet, The Secret History of the Harrier by Michael Pryce is out today. Michael, thanks very much indeed.
Thank
Good to have you here.